A fast 50mm prime could end up being the best lens you ever buy for yourself. But it's impossible to really appreciate how this lens can change your photography until you actually own one. Most people won't buy a lens until they are convinced that it's the right lens for them anyway. So do you see the problem here? Everyone should have a fast 50mm lens in their kit. It's the most essential lens for a creative photographer. It gives you access to bokeh, gives you powerful street perspective, gives you the perfect lens for both still life and portrait. Yes, portraits, and I'll talk more about that later in the video. The main reason people don't buy a 50mm lens is because they already have the 50mm focal length covered with one of their existing zoom lenses. So why get a separate lens that can do only one thing? I've gone into greater depth about primes versus zoom in a separate video, but for this discussion, I'm going to tune into one major reason: bokeh. Every lens has its own unique characteristics for bokeh, but the starting point is simply how wide open the aperture goes. You get a lot more bokeh on a 50mm lens at f2 than you do at f8. These two apertures are worlds apart. And why is bokeh important? Because it's a powerful tool for composition. Bokeh lets you simplify a complex scene. It lets you build depth into a scene, and it paints light in unique ways that can be worked into your compositions. A 50mm lens can do magic with bokeh in ways the human eye can only imagine. Every camera brand makes a decent 50mm lens. It used to be that f1.4 was the mark of quality when we're talking about 50mm, although in the last decade, f1.8 lenses have proved to be excellent too. The difference is simply being able to make a lighter and smaller lens with the modern technology. But it's still holding on to some of that bokeh magic. Anything at f2 or faster is in the zone of what I call a fast 50. And it's not just the camera manufacturers too. The majority of lens makers build a 50mm prime lens, except for Tamron, which really annoys me. They make a whole bunch of great lenses, but they don't make a fast 50mm. Sigma, on the other hand, have been working up quite a collection of fast 50s, and recently they added an f1.2 for L-mount and Sony. Right now, Sigma probably make the world's best 50mm lens. And that's saying something because there are a lot of great 50mm lenses to choose from. Most of the fast 50mm lenses out there today are very, very good, but not all. Lens design has advanced a lot over recent decades, and even the very best lenses from 20 years ago simply don't stand up as well against some of the new top-shelf designs. For sure, most of the cheaper DSLR primes are going to look a little soft compared to a brand new lens made for mirrorless systems. So putting an older DSLR lens adapted to your mirrorless may not be the best move here. You don't have to invest in a super heavy over-engineered 50mm lens to enjoy the world of fast primes. The latest lightweight designs are still great. Things like the 50mm 1.8 from Lumix or the f2 from Sigma are super small and super light and deliver a ton of fun. These are so compact and so easy to pack. There's no excuse for not having one in your camera bag. The tricky thing about shooting with a narrow depth of field is that sometimes you're going to miss the focus on what matters. And when you do miss the focus, that shot is no longer going to be useful to you. There's a lot of ways to handle this problem. Firstly, make sure your autofocus is tuned to suit the subject. You need to be in control of the autofocus and not just let the camera decide for you. Picking a smaller sized AF box instead of the entire screen is a good start. Be intentional about where you land that focus and get to know how your camera autofocus works. Take control of the camera, make it work for you. Second, make sure to take lots of photos. If you know you're going to get it wrong half the time, then double down on your shots. Reassess the focus and then shoot again, even if you think you've nailed it the first time. It costs nothing to take those few extra frames. Thirdly, look for repeating errors in your shots. Are you consistently focusing too far behind the subject, for example? Lots of folks get paranoid about how accurate their camera focus is, and they blame the lens. But in truth, the fault is usually in our own hands. Watch yourself carefully when you take a capture and check if you're actually shifting your body in between grabbing a focus lock and hitting the shutter. I do this all the time, and I have to remind myself to hold properly still when working in tight with a subject. Movement is more of a problem with macro or still life, where even a centimetre can make a difference. With practice, your hit rate will get better. Autofocus on cameras these days is really amazing. I throw away 90% of my photos anyway, and focus is very rarely the problem. 50mm is the sweet spot for still life photography. It's wide enough to be practical in most settings, but not so wide that it drags in half the room when you don't want to. 50mm is often referred to as a standard lens because it yields a similar field of view to the human eye. Lenses that go wider than the human eye, they're called wide, and if they go longer than the human eye, they're called telephoto. Standard is the bit in the middle. When I talk about still life, I could be referring to scenes at a market, or maybe flowers in a garden, or even the entire genre of food photography. My wife and I run a special food photography workshop every year, and the number one piece of gear to bring along is a 50mm fast lens. It's super rare that we shoot food with anything other than a 50mm lens, and super rare that we step away from the magic of f2. We want that 50mm perspective, but also want the dramatic shallow focus to bring attention to the hero of our compositions. f2.8 is nice, but f2 is where the magic really happens. It turns out real life portraits are similar to still life photography. That same 50mm lens is what we use for portraits of chefs, for example, and I want to get some shots of the lovely locals. I remember years ago there was a trend where people started to call an 85mm lens a portrait lens. And that was confusing because in the old days of medium format, 85mm was the portrait lens, and 85mm on a medium format is 50mm on a DSLR. So there's a bit of confusion there. I will just say that 85mm is a very long lens. You're not getting the same context that you would from a 50mm. You lose so much context and you are limited to what style of portrait you can shoot. So that's why we stick with 50mm, and the faster the better. Once again, f2 or faster is where the magic happens. The entire point of a fast lens is bokeh. So is there a lot of difference between the bokeh at f1.2 versus f2? There sure is. Most of what I shoot is going to be at f2 because that's my sweet spot for getting enough detail while still pushing plenty of bokeh. But this all depends on how close you are to your subject, or to be clear, how close your out of focus elements are to the lens. If you stand really close to a still life scene, then you get a much more narrow depth of field compared to shooting a distant mountain range. You see the shallow effect much more strongly on things that are near. This is when those f1.2 lenses are an extra bonus for those times when you do need to step back a little from the scene for your composition, but you still want a little bokeh. That's when moving from f2 to f1.2 is really powerful. For most people, the real question is the difference between f2 and f2.8. There are a lot of f2.8 lenses on the market these days, a lot. You can hit 50mm at f2.8 with many zoom lenses, so why bother with a fast 50mm prime? Why push to f2 when f2.8 is a little cheaper and more in reach? The reason is that while f2.8 is nice, f2 is just so much better. The more you lean into the effect of shallow focus, the more intentional it looks. f2.8 just doesn't always look like you're reaching for bokeh. Sometimes it looks like you simply made a half step. And if you're going to shoot wide open, I suggest you go all the way. Given that there are times when f2 is not shallow enough even, f2.8 might just be setting yourself up for disappointment. There's also a good lesson here about how we learn in general and how we gain skills. If we take a half step to experiment, then we only get to see half of the effect, and sometimes not even that. It's the same thing for editing raw files. If you want to see what a slider does for your image, don't just give it a tiny nudge. Give it a big yank, and then you can far more clearly see what that tool is doing. That's how we learn better, by seeing a clear effect. F2.8 is a nudge, F2 is intentional. So when learning how to work with shallow focus, I recommend at least an F2 lens. If you can get hold of F1.4 or even F1.2, then that's just all the better. I hope you've been at least a little bit swayed towards considering adding a fast 50mm to your camera bag. At the end of the day, if you decide you don't like it and shallow focus is not your thing, you can always just sell it again. I've got a few other videos here where I talk about lenses and the difference between primes versus zoom. You might like to have a look at those too, and have a great day.